Right, so I've seen Bohemian Rhapsody now. I'm not going to do a full review, largely because most of you have probably seen it already, looking at the amount of money it's making. And also, I kind of broadly agree with all the reviews that you've doubtless already read, both the good ones and the bad ones. It is great fun. It's very cinematic, moves along at a hell of a clip. It's very entertaining. The musical sequences, in particular the Live Aid sequences, are gobsmacking, and Rami Malek is beyond astonishing. But there are things wrong with it. It does take some fairly outrageous liberties with the timeline. Early fears that it was going to straightwash Freddie are kind of unfounded. I mean, yeah, a lot of it's about his relationship with Mary Austin, but that was the most important relationship in his life in many respects. It does also show that finally getting together with Jim Hutton, who was the boyfriend who stayed with him until he died, was possibly the best thing that ever happened to him. Although, I've got to say, there is something not entirely un-homophobic about the way the movie depicts gay stuff, which in this film basically means having a moustache and listening to disco, as this seamy underworld into which Freddie is lured by those who mean him no good, by those who seek only to exploit and take advantage of him, and from which he duly returns, chastened and penitent, and with AIDS, to the wholesome embrace of an enormous 70s stadium rock band. That's how you know this is being told from Roger and Brian's point of view. It's when that being in one of the biggest stadium bands of the 1970s is kind of the wholesome alternative to all that weird stuff Freddie was doing in New York and Munich. One thing I would like to say in the film's defence, which is something I've not heard anybody point out yet, is this. They cast guys who can play. That's something very few rock biopics bother doing. Not only does Gwilym Lee look and sound weirdly like the young Brian May, but he also obviously plays lead guitar well enough to at least be able to pretend to play like Brian May. I've worked out a lot of Brian May's guitar solos, and I'm watching Gwilym Lee's fingers going, yep, that's what you do. That's how you play that. And like a lot of you, I think when the cast list was first announced a few months ago, I was like, seriously, Joseph Mazzello? The kid from Jurassic Park is playing John Deacon. But turns out that right now, evidently, the actor in the English-speaking world in his early 30s who plays bass guitar well enough to play Queen songs and who looks the most like John Deacon just happens to be the kid from Jurassic Park all grown up. Send for the dialect coach. But I come neither to praise nor bury Bohemian Rhapsody, but merely to make this observation. It's the film it was always going to be. That's the only Queen movie we were ever going to get, certainly for at least another 20 years or so. Because here's the thing, it runs right into what I would call the curse of the rock biopic. If you're going to make a movie about a dead rock star, and you want that dead rock star's songs to feature in the movie, and let's face it, you do want the dead rock star songs to feature in the movie, then you've got to get the permission to use those songs from everybody who has any kind of controlling stake in those songs. Whether it's surviving family members, surviving band members, management, song publishers, everybody who owns any part of that music has to be on board with the film in some way. So the Queen movie we've just got was the only Queen movie we were ever going to get. It's the Brian and Roger approved version of events. This is an inherent flaw in the rock biopic, and there's only one movie I can think of that successfully finds a way around it. And it's this. Backbeat. I just bought it on DVD on eBay because this film is actually quite hard to get hold of these days. Came out in 1994. As the title implies, it's about the Beatles. I'm a massive Beatles nerd, as I imagine a lot of you know. And I've seen an awful lot of movies about the Beatles, and moreover, I've seen a lot of awful movies about the Beatles. They are probably the most heavily biopicked celebrities in the modern era that I can think of. And most movies about the Beatles either smack into the same problem that Bohemian Rhapsody just did, they're slightly sugary affairs because they want the songs, or they tend to be these kind of weird, joyless drama documentaries with no music in about how screwed up John Lennon was. Backbeat finds a very clever way around this because it's about the Beatles, but it's about the very early Beatles when they were still a five-piece playing in Hamburg, and they were basically a covers band. They had started to write songs yet, but they weren't really incorporating them into the set much because the audiences they were playing to, being basically drunken American sailors and German prostitutes, didn't want to hear whatever John and Paul had written in the dormitory the night before. They wanted to hear Long Tall Sally. They wanted to hear Good Golly Miss Molly, and that's what this movie basically shows the Beatles playing. It is quite cheeky because there are a lot of songs which are very heavily associated with the Beatles, which are not actually Beatles songs. They're the covers that they did on their early albums, like Money, That's What I Want, like Good Golly Miss Molly, like Long Tall Sally, like Please Mr. Postman, and they're all in here, sung in a fairly Beatlesque fashion by what was actually a supergroup of American grunge rockers who were put together to put the soundtrack together. They basically just gave them a bunch of vintage instruments, a list of rock and roll standards, and said turn everything all the way up and play these, and that apparently is a pretty decent approximation of what the Beatles sounded like in Hamburg, and it certainly works within the context of the film. So the film has a lot of songs which are kind of thought of as Beatles songs. Twist and Shout is the obvious one. Again, everybody thinks that as a Beatles song. It's not. It's an Isley Brothers song. The film contains a lot of songs which are thought of as Beatles songs but are not actually Beatles songs, and as such no surviving Beatles or Yoko needed to be approached for permission to use them. And as such you get not warts and all exactly, but a not entirely sympathetic depiction of the Beatles. The film is mainly about Stu Sutcliffe, the Beatles' original bass player, who left while they were in Germany. It's about why he joined the band in the first place, why he leaves and what happens then, and why people don't really talk about Stu Sutcliffe anymore. It's quite a moving little story, really, and even would be, even if it weren't true, and even if the band in question wasn't in the process of becoming the best band in the world. But certainly the depiction of John Lennon in this is very convincing. My parents knew, well, my mum knew John Lennon. She was in the late 50s briefly going out with a guy called Eric Griffiths, who was one of the other Quarrymen, who were John Lennon's school band that would ultimately evolve into the Beatles. So she bumped into Lennon a few times, apparently tried it on with her once, and she told it to naff off. Which, given that also little Ringo used to kind of stalk her when they were at primary school together, means that by the time my mum turned 18, she turned down half the Beatles. I told her she was a legend. Anyway, the way my mum remembers John Lennon is that nobody liked him very much. He was basically regarded as a bit of a bad-tempered bastard, a bit of a psycho, a bit of a troublemaker, and just somebody you really didn't want around. And Ian Hart as John Lennon in this is the only time I've ever seen the John Lennon who has been described to me by people who knew him depicted on film. I mean, by contrast, possibly the most facially convincing depiction of John Lennon ever is Mark, brother of Paul, McGann in 1984's John and Yoko, A Love Story, in which, incidentally, a very young Peter Capaldi plays George. But that is, as the name suggests, very much the Yoko-approved version of events. So it's this weirdly saintly John Lennon that Mark McGann plays, even if he does look weirdly like him. Now, Ian Hart looks a bit like John Lennon. He actually weirdly looks more like Julian Lennon. But the John Lennon that Ian Hart plays in this movie does correspond more closely to the John Lennon as has been described to me by my mum and other people who knew him from back in the day, back in Liverpool. So yeah, see if you can find this movie. I had to buy it on eBay. It's not on Amazon as far as I can tell. It's certainly not on Netflix. It's not even on iTunes. It was quite well received at the time. It was slightly buried by the fact it was a British movie that came out the same year as Four Weddings and a Funeral, and so that became the only British movie anybody wanted to talk about. But next year is the 25th anniversary of its release. It came out in 1994, so maybe it's due a bit of a reissue. Anybody who owns the rights to this, get on it. So that about wraps this up. If you haven't seen Bohemian Rhapsody yet, do check it out. It is worth a look. It is great fun. It's not the best movie ever, but it's probably the best movie that it was ever going to be. All right, see you soon.
This video was made possible by the supporters of my Patreon project, who help me make fun things while receiving great perks and rewards. If you enjoyed it, why not follow the link and join us?